CS, I remember in 7th or 8th grade, I attended this coding camp. We were trying to learn Python in a sort of gamified fashion, but I wasn't really into games, and so I didn't find it that interesting. And it wasn't until a couple years later when I watched The Matrix and I was like, oh, I really want to be Trinity and learn how to code. It was really nerdy of me, but that's when I decided, you know what, I'm going to try to learn Python on my own. From there, after a couple of weeks trying to figure out loops and functions and definitions and all that stuff, I decided to apply to a research program, and that summer was the first summer that I got like hands-on research experience in the field of computational science. We were working on big data and just taking these really large data sets and processing them down and extracting information from them that you wouldn't be able to do by hand because they're just so large. And from there, I kind of was able to explore a lot more of the computational science field, and every summer I just really tried to figure out if I wanted to go into like specific aspects of it and narrow down like the sort of the breadth that the CS field offers. So there's this phenomenon called math anxiety that I didn't really discover until my year in high school of Calculus BC. Just for some context, I was the only girl in my class, and so at that time I didn't really attribute it to gender because I feel like it's such a nebulous territory where you're like, is this just because I'm a girl or is this because I don't believe in myself? But it wasn't until I was talking to other women who were interested in STEM, mathematics, and CS in particular, where they were talking about going through the same sort of thing where it was like they could do the problems, but as soon as people were watching or as soon as they had to like speak up about it, it would make them really nervous. And I think that for me, that was a major kind of turnoff at first because I was thinking, you know, it perhaps isn't the right field for me. If I'm feeling not confident enough to go into it or underqualified, like why should I do it? And I think it really helped being able to talk to people like other girls who have gone through it and who have decided to continue and realize that it's something that you can work through, and it's something that you realize that it's just a existing problem that needs to be solved. I think what I've come to realize is that you really, especially in computer science, I think you learn a lot about resilience just from going through the motions of debugging, which sometimes it will take a whole day to figure out the one bug in your program, and it is the most frustrating experience. But once you get it and your code works, I think it's a bit of a metaphor for this whole experience where for me personally, I think I just came to realize that I'm the only person who really knows my own abilities, and I shouldn't adjust those expectations or those beliefs just because of my perceived status in the room, or I don't need to feel like I have to prove myself. I should be able to just perform to my abilities and push myself based on what I expect of myself rather than what others would think. So I think it was a journey to get to that point, but I think that, you know, by talking about it and just reaching out to people and having that supportive environment of other women and other girls who were also going through a similar thing or who had gone through a similar thing could give advice, that was really helpful. I think most people that sing always say they've always been singing, and so for me that's definitely true. I grew up with like my dad, he plays guitar and he sings, so he always kind of wanted to do folk music with me, and so we would sing a lot of traditional Chinese folk, and I would perform at like those kid talent shows. And then as I grew older, I became more aware of like opera and classical voice and a lot of the more training oriented art forms. So I did want to try that, and my parents were pretty supportive of that. So I started deviating a little bit from like the Disney sort of music and more into classical voice. I think the interesting thing about doing a lot of science and a lot of music at the same time was that you really started seeing the connections and the parallels between them. So I did this masterclass once with a bass baritone, and I remember I finished singing, and his first big piece of advice for me was just to think of the high notes instead of as high notes, but to think of them as sort of like faster vibrations, and to think of low notes as slower vibrations, which is basically what they are, right? And so I think a lot of the times when you do, anatomy is also a big part of vocal training, where you have to be aware of how your larynx feels all the time, because you don't want to squeeze, otherwise you could damage the vocal cords. So you really start seeing the intersections between STEM and music, and that's when you start realizing like there's so much interdisciplinary connection between the two, and that knowing more about one field actually improves your knowledge about the other because you approach different things with different lenses and it's much more nuanced. In the future, I think my music background will definitely influence the way I approach STEM, because I think a major part of it is being able to communicate well, to be able to almost kind of perform on that stage when you're defending a thesis or when you're presenting your research, and be able to kind of connect it with your audience, whether that be a general audience or an audience of experts. And I think when you do a lot of music, a lot of the training and a lot of the practice is in how to best communicate the text to the audience, and whether or not to maybe be louder at this part or softer at this part, and to really shape the nuances of it. And so I think in that sense, that's probably the more like concrete way it would influence my future in STEM. But I think also on the larger scale, when you think about music, it's not so much of a like reading notes as it is more of a sort of like nebula, right, of just notes and phrasing and dynamics and timbre. You have this two-dimensional sheet of paper, that's the sheet music, and you read off it and whatever, but what you're really trying to do is you're trying to create this multi-dimensional experience for your listeners and for yourself. There's so many dimensions to it, and I think that's what I'm trying to say about science, is that you start realizing when you study music or when you study science that it's not so much about producing a paper or like finding a very tangible result, but it's more so of locking in another piece of the understanding of the world, whether that is through art or through STEM. And I think that in itself is a very beautiful thing that you would appreciate more coming from the dual perspectives of both music and science.
My name is Ashley Levy, and I'm a vocal producer, songwriter, and engineer. I was 16 years old when I started writing music. Wow, that was a long time ago, but I pretty much saved up all of my allowance money for a computer that had GarageBand in it, and that's how I got started. I didn't even have a microphone. I would just record into the little dot that came with the computer. I really didn't have a choice. I had a whole bunch of music in my head as a kid, and I was like, how am I gonna get it out into the world? Well, my typical workday is great because I work for myself as a vocal producer, songwriter. I go to a session where I work with an artist, maybe another producer, and we write a song. And in 4 to 8 hours, we have a fully realized track, top line, song mixed, done. I'm in a session with new artists every day, and everyone has a story to tell. Thanks to my technical knowledge, we can get through the process of telling that story a lot faster. So I'm really happy that my technical skills and my creative skills allowed me to work in a field that makes me happy and makes other people happy.